Hello, Jeando.
Hello, Kevin. Good morning.
Good morning. In the last video, we were talking about the development of the will and how to train the will, and how that's what we're doing in the initial Alexander technique is training the will. So it might be useful for you to explain to people more about what we mean by the will. What is the will? What isn't the will? Because people have a lot of misunderstandings about this. They tend to think it's maybe like raw willpower and it's like harsh self-discipline and it's something like this, but we're talking about something more intelligent, skillful, dynamic, adaptable. So can you let people know a little bit more about what you mean by the will? And then how does training the will in the lessons that we do here, how does that transfer over to the rest of your life? Is this just something you learn as a skill in a lesson and then that's it and it doesn't really work for other things? Or is there a relationship between learning in this formal, precise way and then the ordinary acts of your life, and then any special skills or activities you want to learn on top of that?
Yeah, there are many questions about the will because for some reason in modern days the will and volition are not considered very well by most people. They have something about using the power of will, and rightly so. Yeah. Will in itself can be really dangerous. That is, you can make yourself do all sorts of things and force yourself into doing things that could be wrong, reprehensible, or you know what. Or you could maybe think you're doing the right thing, but as a result of all these efforts, of focusing your attention on something that is not particularly agreeable to do, otherwise you wouldn't need will. Most people need will because they lack interest in something. So there is a disconnection in the field of attention between what they have to do and what they would like to do. And so they are caught into this problem. I would like to study, but wow, there is the TV, there are shows, there are all sorts of agreeable and some like intellectual foods that are not really good for you. They have a very low grade, but these intellectual food are really seductive. So how do you construct the will? How do you develop the will? That's what I want to explain today. I will add one little part on top of what you described, and that part is how is it really obtained in a lesson, in a long distance lesson. So I've prepared a few images so that you can really objectivate what I'm going to discuss, how the will and reflective thought have to be linked together, have to be married together in order to develop, to obtain what we call the development of the will. So I think I want to start with the beginning, which is what I think the will is and what I think it is not. So what it is not, that's quite easy. The first thing we have to have in mind is that when we discuss the development of the will, we don't think about an increase in power of the will. No matter what, I will do something, or I will go against every feeling I have, or no. This is absolutely not the idea. The idea behind this development of the will is, first of all, this power or growing power that is going to develop with time to freely make decisions. And so to freely make decision, or to make decision if you want, Alexander really plays the stage that you will have to make decisions. That is, that you'll have to choose between a spontaneous reaction, what we feel we ought to do, and a more deliberate decision, a more deliberate one. So I have to decide when I'm stimulated to do something, what is the reason combination of action, what they ought to do to obtain the goal in such a way as to, in fact, promote general functioning. So if I have to, for example, sit down, how could I sit down with a series of actions? So actions of the ankle and the knee and the hips, hold the torso, as well as the shoulders, where should they be, in order for me to, for example, enhance my capacity of breathing, enhance my equilibrium, enhance my, well, anything. The easy movement of the arms, or the capacity to change direction or to stop. So that will rest on the development of the will. In another sense, second sense, is the capacity to obey one's own reasoned decisions of movement, or one's own reasoned decision of inhibition of movement. Obeying is very, very interesting to observe when one is subjected to these kinds of lessons, to see how one reacts, how one tends to forget things that have been decided 2 seconds ago because something happened. So the idea behind the development is the increased capacity to follow commands, follow orders. And when these orders detail a plan that is explicit, and a plan to fulfill the general decision to react, and so how to react in a new way, how to discover also through that system, so that process, as Alexander called it, a new way of reacting. And then today, I want to develop another aspect that is will, or development of the will in a more technical sense. That is, Alexander presented as the capacity, or the increased capacity to carry out orders of definite performance combined with orders of definite inhibition. And that is something that is not really thought about. So the background of all these ideas is that there is no development of the will without a development of the association of will and the reflective thought. We must understand that will is not primary, will is secondary to reflective thought. So in the last interview, I defined will as the capacity to link words, intentions, that is orders, decisions, but these are words, these are ideas, thoughts, linking thoughts with actions. Today, we want to grow a step. And that step is that we are going to see that what we are after is linking up will, decisions, with reflective thought. So how is it possible to link up reflective thought and will? And I place reflective thought in first, but reflective thought without will, without the volition, without that idea of the capacity to carry out orders of definite performance or orders of definite inhibition, well, this reflective thought will end up being completely detached from our action and will not make us more unified, more complete, So it's very important to understand that. In the session, there is a definite process to link up the method of forming habits of reflective thought. And that was a big question. And it's interesting to, well, I will present, of course, some text from, well, it's not from Alexander. It's from John Dewey, as you will see. And here it is. This is a late book. It's from 1933. So it's the book, very interesting book that is called How We Think. Yeah. And John Dewey is presenting a problem of method. How do you create lessons, sessions, if you want, that are going to help a person form habits of reflective thought? Okay, and for us, the problem is even greater because we are not teaching like formal education. We are not teaching mathematics or English or any other intellectual, fairly intellectual domain. No, we are into the psychophysical field where we are just teaching people ordinary actions like sitting, standing, walking, going up, sitting down, all these sorts of actions that you, well, most of the time would not associate with this habit of reflective thought. And contrary to the appearance, it's exactly the opposite. So we need to see what Dewey has to say first about the habit of forming habits of reflective thoughts. And second, you will see how this will help us to organize a session of the initial Alexander technique. So the problem is first of establishing condition that will arouse and guide our curiosity. We must give us some sort of problems and some sort of also of leverage onto the problem. If the problem is massive, if the problem is overwhelming you, if you have no way to manipulate what's coming in or what's coming out of the big mechanism, there is no way you can arouse or guide your curiosity. So it's very important to, of course, present problems of reflective thoughts, but at the same time, my job is to help people manipulate this problem, start to see how they can interact with it. It's not the fact that I solve the problem that has any interest in the development of reflective thought. It's the fact that the student is starting to see that his own reflective thought is giving some sort of lead. Lead or connection. So the problem is of setting up connections in things experience that will, on later occasion, when the student is alone, promote his own flow of suggestion so that he can create problems and purposes that will favor consecutiveness in the succession of ideas. Obviously, I'm taking that sentence for my own use. My own use is creating sessions, creating lessons of conscious guidance and control. But my idea, these lessons are lessons where the main idea is to develop the volition, develop the will of that person. That will has to be guided by habits of reflective thoughts. So this is the benchmark of these sessions, and for the moment it may be very, very intellectual, but you will see in very little time it's going to become much more concrete, because our definition of volition is much more interesting in the sense that we have a practical way of presenting to the student what is inhibition, what is volition, and what is inhibition, as you will see. So I'm immediately going back to looking at text from Alexander, of course, and he's looking at exactly the same thing as Dewey, but he's presenting it in a very different form. He's looking at methods of educations. So you remember Dewey, he was discussing problem of methods in developing reflexive thoughts. And so Alexander is talking of the people that are developing methods of education. Well, any teacher is responsible for methods of education. So Alexander is talking about the conventional methods, and you will see that because he's talking of conventional methods, he's developing his own non-conventional method. So I'm interested, and any teacher should be interested in developing his own methods of education. And so it's very important, as Alexander said, because these people that are responsible for the conventional method of education, I'm reading from the text now, well, they have not realized the importance of holding the balance true in every sphere of life between the desire to do, volition, and the ability to check that desire, inhibition. I will come back to the explanation a bit later. For the moment, let's continue with what Alexander is talking about. He says, the words volition and inhibition are in constant use in these pages. These are the pages of this book. And I wish at this point to point out that, to make it very clearly understood, that they are used merely as name for two respective acts. Volition standing for the act of responding to some stimulus or stimuli to psychophysical action, doing, and inhibition standing for the act of refusing to respond to some stimulus or stimuli to psychophysical action. Non-doing, that's what you call it, not doing at that period. In other words, volition is used to name what we intend to do, and inhibition to name what we refuse to do. That is, to name what we wish to hold in check, what we wish to prevent. So let's go back, and we are going to see how reflective thought and will are going to have to combine in order to follow Alexander's instruction. So, well, the first thing, I am not a person that is saying that inhibition is all. That you need to develop inhibition, that inhibition is the center of the technique. No. The center of the technique is holding the balance true all the time in ordinary activity. Yeah? Because Alexander is, of course, he has a general idea. He is not creating lessons for intellectual development. He's not presenting lessons for physical development. We have this idea of sessions and lessons that are there to develop psychophysical activity. That is how to join the intellectual, the reflective thought with action. And in order to get the action visible, you need in between volition. Because you can have fantastic ideas in your mind, fantastic ideas of what you want to do or what you don't want to do, and in the end find yourself into doing what you don't want and not doing what you would like to do. That's a very common occurrence, which shows that it's absolutely necessary for us to use and teach this new possibility of making reflective thought and volition act together so that we can have action at the end that can, in fact, correspond to the idea we had in the first place. correspond to the intellectual scheme or intellectual plan we had in mind. So that is the idea. But now, wow, how do you translate this in practice? So here you will see that the idea is coming from Alexander. Yeah. So Alexander is describing sessions, is describing how he teaches. But I was surprised when I started to train as an Alexander teacher, as a modern Alexander teacher, that this sentence did not really correspond to what I was experiencing. Therefore, instead of just fighting against the establishment, no, I decided to, create my own translation. And so I'm going to see with you how I have organized the session so that they can correspond to what I'm going to read now. I'm reading from the book. It's Alexander's third book. It's The Use of the Self. And Alexander is describing here ideal lesson. So a model of lessons. And I've tried during all my teaching life to more and more correspond to that model. So the experiences involved in acquiring a knowledge of such right and natural use of the self gives a person a criterion of judgment to go by, and also an understanding of relative values. For in this process, he is constantly brought up against situations in which, after receiving a stimulus, he has to decide what manner of use is best to employ in reacting to it, and also to judge which of the direction for this manner of use is primary, which secondary, and so on. So I think this needs some explanation. So I have added a few elements in this that are not part of the text. Everything you see in brackets is not part of the original text. So the first thing I say is that during the session, the student has to make experiences, and I added experiences of command. What I want to say with this is very clear. The criterion of judgment that the student is going to use to guide his will is not a feeling of what's happening. It's not the feeling experience communicated, for example, by the hands of the teacher. No, that's not the point. Here, we are going to see that in these sessions, the criterion of judgment is derived from experiences of command. That's why I added experiences of command in brackets. Yeah. And so in order to acquire a right use of the movement of the different part, the general use of the self, this will give a person a criterion of judgment to go by. The understanding of relative values is something else. Yeah. And so at first, my first really wrong here. I thought that it was like moral relativism, where values, that is how people should behave, that's what we call moral values, that moral values were relative to the environment, relative to the civilization in which you are. But in fact, it's absolutely not that, because we are describing a technique. So we have to have, first of all, an understanding of relative values, of technical relative values, so that the student can develop an understanding of these technical values. Yeah. And so to prove that it's not a criterion of judgment, that is the feeling experience, Alexander is fortunately adding that the student will be brought up against situation in which, after receiving a stimulus, you will see, simple stimulus, he has to decide which manner of use is the best to employ in reacting to it. Well, that is, the student has to make a choice as to which movement of the parts is going to employ when reacting to the goal, to the stimulus of reaching the goal. And so the last part is really something Alexander think for himself, which is he has to judge which of the directions is primary, secondary, and so on. So if you want to understand that, it's just that the primary direction are absolutely inhibitory in nature. You should never do it. You should never let the neck be free. You should never try to get the head forward and up. You know, that these are the primary direction. You should never try to lengthen the back or to direct the knees forward and away. These are the primary direction. All that is of interest to us are the secondary directions, which are the means whereby you can get the result of the primary direction. That is, if you want the neck to be free, you have to, as Alexander explained, organize the mechanism of the torso. If you want the head to go forward, you need massive support. If you want the back to lengthen and widen, you have to organize the different movement of the parts of the torso. That is what is meant here. Yeah. And so now, well, this was like a moment of despair, a moment of, well, real incoherence, because Alexander is not explaining what he means by these relative values. The teachers say to you, you need an understanding of relative values, and he leaves you at that. Well, how could you go forth? Well, the way it happened to me was more like a surprise. I suddenly discovered something that could some way be related to relative values. And that came from the moment where I started to study the history of the technique, the fact that Alexander said that he was a Delsarte teacher when he started teaching this technique. And so most of my colleagues don't imagine an instant that this can be true. They think he's lying. But well, it's still interesting to look at what the Delsarte system was about at the time. And so here comes the an idea that led me to the understanding of relative value. So during the session, okay, there is what we call the technical training. And so here we have relative values in practice. This is Delsarte quoted by Braun MT in 1886, 10 years before Alexander started to teach. And so he says, let the student note 3 things which will apply to his technical training of the acting agents of expression. And he quotes them: the head, the torso, the legs, the arms, the hands, the fingers. We are discussing a technique for helping an actor become capable of wielding different attitude, different gesture. And so in order to direct the wheel, well, it's necessary for the student to use instruments. And so here are 3 instruments. The first one, relative to the agent of expression, the parts, Alexander called them the parts of the torso, parts of the arms, part of the limbs. The point of suspension or center of motion of the agent. That's the first point. The second is the momentum or force given the agent. And the third, trajectory described by the agent under these conditions. That's absolutely new. We suddenly see that for these people, the Delsarte students, they were considering the acting agents of expression, the mobile parts, yeah, and these mobile parts were rotating. He's talking about the center of motion of the agent. So for me, I translate it as the center of the motion of the movement of the agent. because if you want a rotation, you have to have a rotation of the agent. So it's quite interesting, and immediately it strikes in my mind that yes, it's clear in the human body, all the joints are generating motions of rotation, and therefore, if you accept, well, first of all, you have to think about it, but you will see that wow, it's quite clear that there are no rectilinear motions in the human body, and so if there is a center of motion, then we have to find it. You have to find ways to reason out where the center of motion can be. Yeah, and then while he's talking about the momentum, you must understand that in these days, people were absolutely interested into system mechanics. That is how to construct bridges, how to construct Eiffel Tower, how to construct and they were very keen on physics. I think physics was taught differently at that time, must have been. And so when you see momentum, that's what does it mean by momentum? It means force by movement, force multiplied by movement. Yeah. And so suddenly we are starting to think that there can be, if you have two paths that have to be coordinated, well, there will be relative momentum, relative speed. If you want a simple way to think about it, it's the speed of one part and the speed of the other part, depending on their force, their weight, how much load has one, as much load as the other, and then you can make a quick calculation of momentum. I understand that for the moment this may sound very, very technical, but I'm a technical teacher, so you will see there are ways for you to represent what I'm talking about in clear examples. And third, a very important word, it was for me at the time, the trajectory described by the agent under these conditions. So I've prepared some images for you to understand what we are talking about, how that this relates, of course, to, well, reflective thoughts, but also our volition, our decisions of doing a movement, decision of refusing to do a movement come into play during the session. So I have taken the image of a student that just started some weeks ago, and so what you see is a standing position. He's got a standing position, unusual. Yeah. But on top of that, there are, of course, the elements that are presented when the student is going to have the session. I'm going to show him this image, and I'm going to see what I've drawn. I've drawn a line, a vertical line. There is a grid, a vertical line, and it's more or less in the front of the foot. And we see that when you stand, it's obvious that there is a part of the torso that we call the rib cage, a rib cage object. And that rib cage object is a cage, fairly rigid, and it's possible, and that student has made the experiment with me, to set a stick on the front of the rib cage. There is a bone there. There are bones that are resisting to compression, so it's possible to place a stick on it. And there is a way to describe this standing gesture by saying that the person is rotating the rib cage, with the lower rib cage going forward and the upper rib cage going back. And for the purpose of directing his mind, we constructed an idea of an armpit line seen from the side. So you see, there is a dotted blue line. Of course, that line does not exist. It's just a line that we construct by imagining a 90-degree line to the front of the rib cage top. At the rib cage top, you have the sternum. You place a stick on the sternum, or a book on the sternum is really good because the book has a 90-degree direction pointing forward. That gentleman is standing. If you place a book on his chest, you will see that the book is inclined backward at the top. And so that is interesting because Alexander says that the habitual incorrect use of the parts of the torso is unduly lifted front part of the chest, which is what we see here. Yeah, arching of the back, protruding abdomen, we've got everything. Good. But now, how do you connect reflective thought and will? Well, we can ask the person that has, well, noticed these actions or the result of these actions as the position is in to start with. I'm going to ask him to see whether he could imagine first directing the lower rib cage front. Is going to place the palm of the right hand on the lower rib cage front. Could he direct the lower rib cage front movement backward in space? Yet, we are discussing a rotation. So, you remember the point of suspension, the center of motion, as it is described. So we said, could it be possible to imagine that the rib cage could rotate around an imaginary point that is at the front of the armpit line side? And I say, you know what would happen if you were capable of not moving, inhibition of the movement, definite inhibition of the movement of the front of the armpit line side when you go back with the lower rib cage, meaning the lower rib cage goes back, but you refuse to go back with the front of the armpit line. And so that's a problem. The student has to represent the problem. The problem is there, and I say, well, what can you say about it? What do you think would happen, for example, the top of that orange bar? If you succeed in moving the lower rib cage back and not moving this center of motion, the point of suspension, backward at the same time. Oh, so the student has to think about it. Maybe we are going to use some object and we are going to apply the reasoning to the object. And when we do so, the student will immediately realize that, yes, there will be a rotation. If you move the lower rib cage back, you refuse to move the lower rib cage midline front, of course, the rib cage is going to start to rotate. And there are going to be a relative action to the movement of the lower rib cage. If you follow this description of the problem, the person will start moving the lower rib cage, not moving the center, therefore the rotate rib cage, and it's absolutely obvious that the top of the rib cage and the neck have to move forward relative to the center of motion. That's how rotation exists. If you refuse to go forward with the neck, if the neck is not free to move forward, then big problem. It's going to be impossible to go back with the lower rib cage without going back with the armpit line front. And so the student is going to connect this intellectual development that is associated with the mechanism, with concrete objects. The rib cage is fairly concrete. You know, where the lower rib cage is in space, where the upper rib cage is in space, are not just, questions that you can ask without never knowing the answer. No. This is measurable. This is control. So we can control the position, but more importantly, we can control the will to obey these orders in practice when the time comes. And that's what I'm going to show you. This is the result. This is the person which has, as you remember, Alexander saying that the person will have to make decision, will have to respond to the stimulus. So the stimulus is rotate the rib cage with very clear instruction to get the lower rib cage back and the armpit line front not moving back. So combining instruction of definite performance with an instruction of definite inhibition. Well, when people are using their will. Well, most of the time it's very focused. It's more like, oh, I'm going to do it. I can do it. Let's go, let's go, let's go. It's like focusing the attention, with the big risk noted by Dewey, by John Dewey, that this will certainly lead to the second or seven devils, which the first of one of which is the mind wandering habit. No, there is no mind wandering here. The person is just seeing how much he can move back, how much he can move forward. And this is in real life condition, ordinary life condition. That is, the person is subject to his equilibrium. And as you can see, he cannot past a certain, that's more or less the idea. He's more or less rotating the rib cage. But if I ask him to see whether he can go just a touch further, just repeat the same organization of action from the new starting point and say, can you get the lower rib cage further back and let the neck be free to move more forward, always relative values relative to the front of the armpit line, then we see that then the front of the armpit line is moving with the top. It's moving forward. Everything is now moving forward. So this is an indication for us. This is an indication that there are impediments to that kind of use of the wheel. It's not the end. It's just the start now of what the lesson, the sessions are going to be. And so the student is constructing expanses of command and is very clear on where he succeeds and where it fails. And so there are questions to be asked as to why past a certain moment there is a failing. Quickly, I want to come back to the result, the end of all this. And again, I'm going to take a little paragraph from John Dewey. But this time it's not the development of the will or the will in relation to interest, but it's a book that is just earlier. It's Psychology, 1886. He doesn't know Alexander, has never met him. I think Alexander read this book with, clear attention. So, in an adult of pretty complete volitional control. Okay, that's interesting. That's a guy that has had many lessons and has developed volitional control. Volitional control meaning the capacity to link up reflective thought with volition. That is the capacity to create a clear plan of volition actions. Yeah. Well, in an adult of pretty complete volitional control, almost all movements, whether of recreation or of business, are connected together through their reference to some unity, some final purpose that the man intends. There is involved, first, a process of inhibition by which all movements not calculated to reach the end are suppressed. Second, coordination by which the remaining movements, the effective movements, are brought into harmonious relation with each other. And third, accommodation, by which they are all adjusted to the end present in consciousness. Okay? Alexander at the time, in 86, at 10 years before Alexander started teaching. Okay? And so it's quite interesting, uncanny, how we can use this in order to create the sessions, create our session of development of reflective thought and, volitional control. So, all the movements are connected together to reference to some unity. That is, we are not wheeling things that are isolated, disconnected. No, 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 no. We are wheeling movements, and we are wheeling inhibition of movements in some, well, final purpose, that is the general use of the self. So here is a quick view of a student that is starting basic Alexander, procedure. He called them exercise at the time. This is the start of the door exercise in standing. It's a book from 1910 and written by Alexander, of course. And he said that the pupil should stand 6 to 12 inches from the door in accordance with the requirements of the part. The teacher should then inform him that he wishes his hips to move toward the door until the body is supported by the door and the torso extends away from it at an angle of about 25 to 30 degrees. So here we have the student is starting, and I've added, as you can see, the same instrument. We have the front of the chest plane in orange, and we have the armpit line seen from the side, and the two lines are 90 degrees to each other, okay? But there, I've added also something that nobody can see, obviously. It's a description of the bone that's inside the lower torso. And that bone, fortunately for us, has at the back, we have the sacrum plate. It's a flat part of the lower spine, and you can set a stick on it, and that will indicate what is the direction of the lower back. And at the moment, we can see that the direction of the lower back and the direction of the upper back is set at an angle. It's a broken line. That is, the person is shortening the back. You find the same similar incorrect directions of movement, and their result in the posture. We see the lower rib cage is very far forward, is protruding the lower rib cage, is unduly lifting the front of the upper rib cage, and of course the shoulders are way too far back and the back is arched. Okay, and so that person is standing at 3/5 distance from the wall. Instead of using 12 inches, like Alexander in his description, I'm using something that is much more, well, to the person. And I want the goal. So what is the goal of the door exercise? Well, very simply, it's to end up with the back against the wall and extending away from the door at an angle of 25 to 30 degrees. Okay, that's simple. So we ask the person to use what he knows, about the secondary direction, about the means whereby, and we see that when bending, there are things happening. Of course, the idea is to direct the lower sacrum toward the door. But immediately, you will see that when bending, the front of the armpit line is already too far forward from the vertical of the ankle. But when the person bends, he goes even further forward. Apparently, the idea of moving the hips back is difficult. Is moving the upper torso forward. That is great. The problem is moving the lower torso forward relatively to the vertical of the ankle, relative values. So we want to move the upper torso forward of the blue line. We want the lower cage that is below the armpit line to move back. So in order for him to understand what's involved, it's that most people have a fear, or it's not intellectualized, but they have great difficulty in directing the hips back. Even Alexander notes it in the famous book from Irene Tasker. Alexander says everybody has a fear of moving the back. And so if you want to move the back, well, that's the idea. So that person is starting to experiment with what are the movements necessary to provide sufficient equilibrium to accept going back. And so we see that this is starting, and we are measuring how much the person is bending, relative values, you remember? And you think, okay, at the moment, depending on how much you go down with the back of the armpit line, and how much you go down with the sacrum, with the back of the pubic line, we are going to see that angle should stay the same if the speed are the same. We are going to calculate very simple geometric object relative to trajectories of movements. If you have an object, and if you want that object to maintain a certain angle to the wall, Alexander said 25 to 31. And obviously, that gentleman in bending, sorry, I missed, in bending, is going down so much faster with the top than with the lower end of the spine that obviously is already passed by 1 degree. And when he wants to reach the wall, we see that it is even going down faster with the top than with the bottom of the torso. Therefore, his angle is way too much. Well, it's not that bad, but it's not exactly the relative values given by Alexander. Alexander is giving 25 to 30. And so you will see what's 30, that's 33, that's much better. And you see that the torso is extending away from the door. So this is very technical. But the student is alone in his room. He's not even looking at himself. He's filmed from the side. So he's starting to have indication on how to construct problems and how to use relative values in order to check, control whether his volition is really like connected to a habit of reflective thought. In this way, he's totally involved in that process of unity where reflective thought and volition and action are all linked up together. I realize that I've been talking quite a long time, therefore, to answer the last question, which is how is this, going to change the life of the person outside of his lessons? First of all, you must understand that in these sessions, we only practice ordinary problems. That is what it is to breathe, what it is to open the mouth, what it is to lift the arm, what it is to stand or to sit on a chair, what it is to bend, what it is to walk, what it is to work in sitting. Therefore, the decisions of movements. So there is, I teach athletic sitting. What is athletic sitting? Athletic is a very interesting Greek word. I don't really speak Greek, but I read a lot of dictionaries that are explaining what words are, what they are supposed to mean. And athletics means people competing for the same end. In this, we are competing to expanding the torso. We are competing to obtain the best use. There is no medal. There is no, you're not going to get fame by that. No. The point is the goal is in itself, or the medal is in itself, is that you are improving your functioning. That is, you can sit 8 hours a day without any back problem, and you can be, athletic means in shape. Athletic, so there is a shape associated with expanding of the torso, and it's a real positive impact on all your life. So that's on the physical side. But now there is also an impact on the mental side. If you start connecting volition with reflective thoughts, with actions, That is that you have to understand that actions are very important here. You have very simple actions you can do to connect reflective thought and volition, which leads to volitional control or development of volition. You name it what you want. You will suddenly find that this is going to change your way of dealing with many, many problems. And you will have a much more rational instead, there are foolish ways to solve some problem, and there are rational ways. And this is a massive impact on people's life. And curiously, also on people's emotional life. You get to see and to feel differently once you connect reflective thought and actions, a life of action. That's it. Anything you wanted to add or?
Yeah, I'm amazed by the quote that you showed from John Dewey there, the book Psychology. I haven't read that before. It's that reads very like an early draft of Alexander's processes of conscious guidance and control, where he has the four stages,
Absolutely.
begins with inhibition as well, and then moves to coordination and things later. Um, it very much seems like Alexander took integrated the practical movement methods of the Delsarte people with the way of thinking about it from the pragmatists, Dewey and William James. I mean, it
Yeah.
just seems like many people who come up with what seems like a technique or way of thinking out of nowhere, but really they've combined two things into a unique way. 'Cause, everything comes from somewhere else. So I think that's the solution to where Alexander to Alexander. I know that will be controversial for many people, but it's after reading that, I'm convinced of this now.
Yeah, but I have a little bit of the same idea. Yeah.
Yeah. So
Anyway,
the
but
idea
I
of
want to add something. Anyway,
sure,
even if that is, it may be or may be not the case. But it's uncanny how it works together so well. But for me, it doesn't matter. For me, I'm not trying to make an historical point. I'm just saying we can use it to create sessions of volitional control or volitional development. That's what I'm saying. I'm saying we can use these as maybe they were intended to be together. They look like they are more or less the same effort. One is providing the practical aspect. The other one is providing that he didn't invent himself, by the way, but and the other is more providing the intellectual or the moral aspect. That's Dewey. And well, it doesn't matter if it's historic or not. The idea is that we want to create sessions that are relevant for our students.
exactly, yeah.
Sorry.
They're tools for us to use now and to teach other people.
Yeah.
Okay, excellent. Thank you, Jeando. So for people watching this video, if you want to learn how to develop the will, to train the will, to do these strange experiments with Jeando, you'll find a link underneath to his Facebook and to his website. And so just thank you, Jeando, and we'll see everybody in
I
the
want
next
to
video.
interrupt again.
Sure.
I never did it, but I should have a long time ago. Is that if you don't want to have lessons with me, I would, well, it's very simple. You can have lessons with Kevin.
Sure. Okay, thank you, Jeando. Okay,
You're
so
welcome.